What happens when a CEO sits quietly in his own cafe, and no one knows who he really is? The carton of milk slipped from Mira's hand, hit the tiled floor, and burst open like a silent warning. The white liquid spread slowly across the ground, as if even time itself held its breath. Mira stood frozen, her face still caught in confusion before she could react. Then came the heavy footsteps from behind the kitchen door. It swung open. Trent, the morning shift manager, stepped out with eyes sharp as blades and a jaw clenched tight in anger. "Drop one more thing," he said loud enough for every customer in the cafe to hear, "and I'll cut your hours down to 2 shifts a week. Just enough to keep you hungry, but not enough to quit." His voice didn't need to rise. It carried the quiet cruelty of someone who had grown comfortable wielding power in the shadows. The entire cafe fell into silence. No one spoke. No one looked up. Not a single guest dared challenge him. But in the dim corner of the room, where the light filtered through a dust-streaked window, one man did not lower his head. A man in his 40s with thick-rimmed glasses, an uneven beard, and a dark coat zipped to his neck, sat motionless behind a full cup of untouched coffee. The name on his order was Leo, but that wasn't his real name. No one in the cafe knew that the man was Adrian Cole, the founder of the Roasted Bean cafe chain. And even fewer knew this wasn't just a random visit. In the moment that carton hit the floor, Adrian saw what no internal report had ever mentioned: the fear in the staff's eyes, the cold stillness in the air, and most of all, a deeply rooted abuse of power that no spreadsheet could measure. He hadn't come for coffee. He had come to see what was being hidden. And from that moment on, he knew he would not be leaving quietly. In the chill of the early morning breeze, Adrian Cole sat in his car, staring at his reflection in the rearview mirror. The thick-rimmed glasses were borrowed from an old movie, the fake beard slightly off-center, and the oversized dark coat made him look more like a drifter than a successful businessman. He pulled the collar higher and whispered the name Leo one more time, as if trying to convince himself of the disguise that even he found unfamiliar. It had been years since Adrian used a false name. Back then, his company was still small enough for him to remember every employee's name, every shift schedule, every regular customer. But now, with the Roasted Bean expanded to 7 locations and wrapped in layers of middle management, Adrian knew that if he walked in as the CEO, no one would tell him the truth. That's why he needed Leo, a nobody, someone anonymous enough to hear the things people usually keep hidden. His phone buzzed lightly in his hand. Last month's revenue report still looked pristine. No unusual drops, no notable complaints, no red flags. But Adrian didn't trust numbers that looked too perfect. In the hidden notes beneath the spreadsheet, he read lines like, "Staff lacks enthusiasm. Team cohesion is weak. Regulars not returning." He understood. Something was happening. Something that couldn't be seen on paper, but hid in glances, in gestures, in the silence between conversations. The memory of the first cafe came rushing back, a small corner shop with a worn-out espresso machine where he once opened the doors himself each morning, made the first cups for a regular named Pete, and smiled genuinely when an elderly woman would bring her dog to sit for hours. That was when the shop was still a part of his heart, not just a brand. But time passed, processes evolved, spreadsheets took over, and feelings faded into the background. Now something told him that if he didn't act soon, the roasted bean wouldn't just lose customers, it would lose the soul it was built on. And that was something he could never allow. The small bell hanging above the door gave a soft chime as Leo stepped inside. The interior of the Roasted Bean, South Elm, felt familiar to the point of being artificial. The air still carried the scent of coffee and vanilla, the same old acoustic playlist, played just loud enough to be heard, and the layout remained exactly as Adrian had sketched years ago. But the atmosphere was completely different. Not the kind of difference that made you uncomfortable outright, but a quiet chill that crept through like winter air seeping through the cracks, silent and persistent. He sat at the table near the window. No one greeted him. No eyes glanced in his direction. Behind the counter, a young barista wiped the surface in a mechanical motion, her gaze distant, as if her thoughts were trapped somewhere in yesterday. Another stood still near the pastry case, arms crossed, showing no interest in either customers or the counter. Every chair scrape, every footstep rang louder than the background music. The whole café felt like a still photograph, where only time continued to move. Then Mira appeared. She smoothed her hair, straightened her crooked name tag, and forced a professional smile. "Good morning, how can I help you?" Her voice was soft but clear, offering just enough warmth to pierce the silence in the room. "Medium black coffee," Adrian replied, noticing how her smile never reached her eyes. When she asked for his name to write on the cup, he paused briefly before saying, "Leo," with an S at the end. Mira asked no questions, simply nodded and scribbled it on the cup as if she had grown used to strange requests and learned never to question anything that might lead to trouble. Adrian sat still, hands wrapped around the warm cup he hadn't touched. He watched how Mira worked, efficiently, precisely, without a single unnecessary movement, and not a hint of friendly conversation with anyone. Not from lack of skill, but from caution. A caution born from learning how to survive in a place where even a greeting could be twisted into evidence against you. And in that moment, he realized this place was no longer a cafe. It was a carefully constructed zone of silence. Adrian remained seated, his hand still resting on the now cold cup. He quietly observed every movement, or more accurately, the lack of movement, around him. Everything unfolded as if a thin, invisible pane of glass separated everything and everyone, employees from customers, workers from their own sense of self. Then, the door behind the counter swung open. Trent emerged, his voice already raised before he even saw anyone. "Mira, how many times do I have to say this? Hurry up, this isn't a daycare." Mira flinched slightly, but didn't turn around. "I'm sorry, it's just," she stammered, eyes downcast. "There's no just anything," Trent cut her off, striding toward the counter, his voice rising with each step. "You have two options. Move faster, or get out." The cafe fell silent. A couple near the window stopped sipping their drinks. A man in the corner pretended to scroll through his phone, but was clearly watching the counter. No one spoke. No one reacted. Because they were used to it. Adrian watched Trent without blinking. In the manager's eyes was a chilling confidence, not the kind that comes from understanding, but from knowing he would never be questioned. From his seat, Adrian could see down the hallway that led to the back storage. A young employee named Malik was emerging, limping slightly on what looked like an injured leg. "Finished already?" Trent snarled. "I don't pay you to stand around breathing." Malik lowered his head and replied softly, "I just needed a quick break. I've been on my feet since 6. "Then don't bother coming in tomorrow," Trent snapped before turning away. Malik stood still for a moment, then quietly returned to the back without a word. There were no screams, no overt threats. But Adrian recognized this kind of power. It was quiet, deliberate, and deeply rooted. It showed itself in every shift cut because someone said their legs hurt, in every cold glance when someone tried to speak up. And that silence was the most dangerous thing of all, because it made people stop believing that fairness was even possible. Adrian didn't need more evidence. He just needed to remember. Because from this point on, the investigation wasn't about checking the atmosphere anymore. It was about preparing to take action. The morning stretched out like a tape on slow rewind, each moment unfolding quietly, yet weighed with gravity. Adrian had yet to take a sip of his coffee, but he had already absorbed a series of truths no internal report had ever revealed. By mid-shift, he stood up and approached the counter, where Mira was carefully recounting change, checking the numbers twice, even though no one was rushing her. She looked up, slightly startled to see him walking closer. "Do you have 5 minutes? Just outside, nothing formal," Adrian asked, his voice warm and calm, never forceful. Mira hesitated briefly, her eyes instinctively flicking toward the hallway where Trent had just disappeared behind a door. But then, as if something in Adrian's gaze made her feel safe, she nodded quickly, almost by reflex. They stepped through the side door that led to the back parking lot. The air outside was colder, but easier to breathe. Mira folded her arms across her chest, her eyes staring into the distance. Adrian didn't ask anything right away. He simply stood there, quietly observing the young woman before him, a woman trying to hold herself together in an environment that demanded she shrink a little more each day. "I sat there all morning," Adrian began, his voice soft as mist. "And I think you know why." Mira said nothing, but her face changed, not surprised, but as if she had seen this coming. "When things started to go wrong, did you try telling anyone?" Adrian asked, still calm. Mira looked away. 2 months ago, I sent an email to HR, she said, her voice flat, as if she had replayed this story in her head many times. No one replied, not even an automatic response. Adrian nodded gently, not interrupting. "I thought maybe it didn't go through, sent it again." Still nothing. Her voice didn't crack, but it thinned out like the air was being pushed from her chest through endurance rather than emotion. "I didn't think it would change anything. I just didn't want to feel invisible anymore." Adrian turned to look at her. For the first time, their eyes met. "You're not invisible," he said, slowly and firmly. "At least not anymore." And in that look, Mira understood. This was no ordinary customer. This was someone who had come to listen, and maybe this time, someone who had come to act. Mira unlocked her phone, her finger gliding slowly across the screen as if tracing an old scar. She stopped, then handed it to Adrian. A simple email appeared. The subject line, only 2 words. Harassment concern. Sent to the HR department. The screen was bare, no reply, no receipt, only a small "read" mark. Below it, a second email, identical, sent 3 days later. Also ignored. Adrian read every word like it was an indictment, not because the content was shocking, but because the silence of the system was the most frightening part. No yelling, no denial, just no response, and everything quietly slipped away. Mira didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. The message said it all. "I'm not trying to get anyone fired," she said softly, her eyes fixed on her palms. "I just want to feel safe when I come to work." Adrian nodded, not taking a picture of the phone. He didn't need more proof. These things, they didn't need to be amplified. They just needed to be seen at the right time. Back in his car, Adrian opened his laptop. The screen lit up with rows of data, all clean to the point of suspicion. Revenue steady, customer feedback positive, shifts distributed evenly. But when he compared it with the turnover report, something felt off. 3 employees had quit in 8 weeks. 2 of them lasted less than a month. The numbers didn't raise alarms, but they echoed with the quiet decay of something deeper. In the HR system, he searched the inbox. No warnings, no complaints, just hundreds of entries filtered, buried under keyword screens, and forgotten. Adrian sat up straighter, his eyes no longer scanning but piercing through the charts. The problem wasn't the people. The problem was invisibility. And now he had seen it. And once you have seen it, you can no longer pretend you have not. That afternoon, Adrian returned to the café. No more dark glasses or fake beard, no oversized coat. He walked in, wearing a dark, pressed shirt, collar buttoned, and a gaze that no longer hid. No one recognized him at first. Marcus was collecting cups behind the counter. Tanya was wiping the glass. Mira was clocking out at the end of her shift. But seconds later, the atmosphere shifted. 1, then 2 people began to realize. This was not the quiet man from the morning. This was the face from the internal newsletter, the founder of the very brand they worked for every day, Adrian Cole. There was no need to say anything, no introductions. The way he stood in the center of the room, hands in his pockets, eyes steady, was enough to change the air. Everyone froze. Marcus dropped a glass, and it shattered into pieces, but no one reacted. Mira stood still, lips slightly parted. Tanya set down the spray bottle and gave a faint nod. It wasn't surprise, it was something closer to relief. Then Trent emerged from the back hallway, clipboard in hand, mouth half, formed around yet another complaint. He stopped short when he saw Adrian. His face paled in an instant, the shift too sudden to conceal. "You?" he stammered, but Adrian simply looked at him. He didn't yell, didn't explode. He just said, "Leave." Trent froze, still clutching the paper like a useless shield. "I heard everything," Adrian said, his voice calm but heavy as a verdict. "I saw how you've been running this place." Trent opened his mouth to object, but Adrian cut him off with a single, final sentence. "You no longer have a place here, and you will never return." No warnings, no justifications, just a boundary, laid down clearly for the first time in months. And no one doubted anymore. This was no longer a cafe run by fear. This was the turning point. And Adrian, at last, had fully shown up. When Adrian returned to the cafe, after that morning's confrontation, no one smiled, no one clapped. But the atmosphere had changed. It felt lighter, as if a thin layer of dust that had settled for too long was finally wiped away. He stood in the staff break room, carrying no documents, entering not as a CEO, but as a man trying to mend something he had once neglected. "I owe you all an apology," he began, his voice low but steady. "I should have been here sooner. I should have seen this earlier." No one interrupted. No one needed to say anything. Adrian continued, not with grand statements, but with something closer to a confession. "I built this place to be different, but I let it run without listening." Clara Jenkins, the interim supervisor Adrian had invited earlier that morning, stood quietly in the back. She wore no suit, carried no briefcase, only a simple name tag and a notebook. "I'm not here to give orders," Clara told the staff. "I'm here to make sure this is a place where your voices carry weight." When Marcus asked about mid-shift breaks, she didn't defer the question. She answered clearly. When Tanya was confused about her schedule, Clara sat beside her instead of towering above her. And Adrian? He set up a small table in the hallway corner, just big enough for 2 chairs and a notebook. No screens, no recorders. He asked each person in turn, "From your perspective, what's really happening here?" Marcus spoke first, then Tanya, then Mira, this time with a voice that no longer trembled. Adrian wrote everything down by hand, no interruptions, no pushback. By the afternoon, the notebook had thickened. He wrapped it carefully and handed it to Clara. "This goes directly to internal oversight. No filters, no delays." Clara nodded, her eyes fixed on him. This was no longer a symbolic gesture. This was the beginning of a system that truly listens. That afternoon, Clara stepped out of the stockroom carrying a receipt and a crate of milk. There was no invoice, no order number. Just a crumpled handwritten note and a neon sticker with faint letters. "Use first, don't say anything." Adrian took the milk carton and checked the expiration date. It was over 2 weeks past due. No further explanation was needed. He photographed every angle, the note, the date, the smudged writing. This time the evidence was not in words. It was in what had once been poured into customers' cups, through silence and deliberate neglect. He turned to Clara and said, "Inventory the entire stockroom, starting now." There was no need to emphasize. A simple nod from her was enough. A few hours later, Adrian asked Mira to meet him in the small office behind the counter. She entered, her expression slightly tense. But this time, he smiled, not politely, but with the certainty of someone who had something meaningful to offer. "I need your help," Adrian said. Mira blinked in surprise. "Me?" she asked. He nodded and slid a manuscript toward her. The cover bore a draft title, "Respect in Practice, a Training Guide from the Ground Up." Adrian continued, "We're rewriting our entire internal training system, but this time not top-down, from the ground up, and I want you on the writing team." Mira looked at the papers, then at him. Her hand trembled slightly as she picked them up. "You really believe I can do this?" Adrian replied without hesitation. "I do. Starting now." A few days later, a new sign appeared on the cafe's glass door. "Closed from 3 to 4 p.m. daily for team rest and connection. Thank you for understanding." No one questioned it. Inside, The lights remained soft, the music still played low. But now, at the central table, Mira was sharing homemade sandwiches with the team. Marcus laughed loudly at one of Tanya's jokes, and Clara poured coffee as if it were her very first shift. No meetings, no bulletins, just a real break for people. No one feared glancing at the clock anymore, and in that quiet, something new began to take root, a culture that was real, one that could never be faked. The doorbell chimed softly in the quiet of the afternoon. A man in a wheelchair slowly rolled into the cafe. His brown jacket was worn, his eyes hesitant. Adrian recognized him immediately, a regular who had once been coldly turned away by Trent for blocking the aisle in the name of safety and policy. Today he had returned, not for the coffee, but in the hope of simply being allowed to exist with dignity. Tanya was the first to notice. She smiled and stepped forward. "We've got a spot ready for you." Marcus silently shifted a table, opening up a clear path. Mira brought over a glass of water without being asked. "Make yourself comfortable," she said gently. The man nodded, visibly moved. No apologies were needed. Every action had already spoken. "This place is yours, and this time, it's real." From a corner near the window, Adrian stood quietly, watching each small detail unfold. Mira was guiding a new employee, a girl who looked no older than 19, her expression uncertain. Myra patiently pointed out where to store items, how to label the syrup bottles, how to check milk dates. "Don't worry, you'll get the hang of it," Mira smiled. "What matters isn't memorizing the rules, it's learning to feel the rhythm of this place." Clara stepped out from the office holding a clipboard. "Another store," she said to Adrian. "Up north, constant staff turnover, no incident reports." Adrian simply nodded. "Go there. And if there's a Mira in that store, listen to her." Clara smiled and walked away, carrying with her something that had been restored. By the window, a new uniform hung silently, stitched with a small line of thread. "You matter here." It wasn't meant for Adrian. It was for everyone who had ever been overlooked, and this time, no one would be forgotten. Corporate culture does not show up in financial reports, but in the way an employee lowers their head when scolded, or how they still manage a smile even when they no longer believe. As a professional, I believe that a sustainable brand does not begin with strategy, but with the courage to reflect on itself, just as Adrian did. If today's story has made you pause and think, don't forget to hit like to support thoughtful content, and subscribe so you won't miss the next journeys. And please leave a comment with the words, "I have seen," if you have ever witnessed an unfair workplace. Every share not only spreads the story, but also helps bring the truth into the light. We may not be able to change the whole world, but we can begin with the place where we stand.